You paid your electric bill last month. In parts of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Holmes County, Ohio, there are families who haven't paid one in decades. Not because they're wealthy and not because they're cheating anyone, but because they still use techniques that were common in American homes before rural electrification reshaped how we live. The average household spends a significant amount every year on utilities that, in many cases, can be reduced, sometimes dramatically, using approaches that were mainstream a century ago. The Amish didn't invent most of these methods. They simply kept using them after everyone else switched to something else. The first time I visited an Amish farmhouse in Ohio, I looked for a thermostat before realizing there wasn't one. The house was still noticeably cooler than a typical modern home in the same heat. It's worth pausing on why that's even possible, because it isn't magic and it isn't mysticism. Older farmhouses were often built with thick walls, small windows on the sun-exposed sides, deep porches or overhangs that block high summer sun while letting in low winter sun, and layouts that took advantage of prevailing breezes. None of that requires religious conviction to replicate. It requires understanding a handful of physical principles that got sidelined once mechanical heating and cooling made design shortcuts affordable. What the Amish preserved wasn't secret knowledge so much as an unbroken habit of building and living around those principles instead of around a thermostat. Now let's go through what's actually behind that. Before mechanical refrigeration was common, many farmhouses had a below-grade storage pit built into a foundation wall, usually on the north side, away from direct sun. Lined with stone and covered with an insulated lid, it stayed in the low to mid-40s Fahrenheit year-round because it was essentially buried in the Earth's stable underground temperature. Butter, eggs, and dairy kept for days without any power. Some Amish households still use versions of this today. As electric refrigerators became affordable and were marketed heavily through the 1930s and 40s, most Americans phased these out. Refrigerators were genuinely more convenient, and companies advertised them aggressively, which is a well-documented part of mid-century consumer history, even if the specific ad budgets and campaigns aren't precisely traceable to a single source. This one is straightforward physics, not folklore. Open a window on the shaded side of the house a few inches from the top, open a window on the sun-exposed side a few inches from the bottom, and hang a dampened linen or cotton curtain over the sun side opening. As warm air passes through the damp fabric, some of it evaporates and pulls heat out of the air. The same principle behind a swamp cooler. Depending on humidity and airflow, interior temperature drops of several degrees are realistic and have been documented in agricultural extension research from the era, though the exact figures vary by climate and house design. That takes us to why most people have never tried this. In 1935, the Rural Electrification Act was signed, aiming to bring power lines to rural America. It succeeded, and it also opened rural households to a wave of appliance sales: refrigerators, electric ranges, and eventually electric heat, often sold on installment plans. Once a family had monthly payments, going back to non-electric methods stopped being a live option. It's worth understanding what the Rural Electrification Act was actually trying to solve, because the full picture is more complicated than a simple story of corporations chasing customers. In the early 1930s, the vast majority of American farms had no electricity at all, while cities were almost fully electrified. Private utilities had largely judged rural service too costly to be profitable, given how spread out farms were. The REA extended low-cost federal loans to farmer-owned cooperatives to build power lines into those underserved areas, and it succeeded quickly. Roughly 1 in 10 American farms had electricity when the REA began, and by the early 1950s, that figure had risen to around 9 in 10. What's also true, and separately documented, is that once those lines went in, appliance manufacturers and utilities pursued rural households aggressively as a new market, often through financing arrangements that locked families into recurring payments. Both things were happening at once. Real infrastructure expansion, genuinely wanted by most farm families, and real commercial pressure riding in behind it. Old order Amish communities make collective decisions about which technologies to accept through a set of unwritten community guidelines called the Ordnung, reviewed and affirmed periodically by each local church district. The reasoning isn't a blanket rejection of technology. It's a case-by-case evaluation of whether a given technology would strengthen or weaken close family and community ties. Connection to the public power grid was broadly judged across many districts to encourage dependence on outside systems and to erode the self-sufficiency and mutual reliance that hold a community together. That's a documented, publicly explained rationale, not folklore. It's the same reasoning that leads some Amish communities to permit certain battery or propane-powered tools while declining a grid connection. And it varies somewhat between different Amish affiliations, which are not all identical in what they permit. The Amish, as a matter of that religious and cultural conviction about self-sufficiency and separation from mainstream systems, largely declined to connect to the grid at all, and so many of these older techniques simply never fell out of use in their communities. Cast iron cookstoves built with an attached water tank, heat water for washing and bathing, using the same fire you're already using to cook. Heat that would otherwise go up the chimney gets captured. These stoves are still bought and sold in Amish communities, and a well-maintained one can last many decades. Rainwater catchment into a cistern, filtered through layered gravel, sand, and slaked lime, is an old and genuinely effective purification method. Lime raises pH and helps neutralize bacteria. Sand and gravel handle particulates. This general approach dates back to Roman-era water systems and was documented in early 20th century agricultural extension literature. A rain barrel or cistern system can meaningfully offset municipal water use, though the exact gallons depend on roof size and rainfall. Built over a natural spring or creek, a small stone structure uses the constant temperature of flowing groundwater, typically in the mid-50s Fahrenheit, to keep dairy and produce cool through the shoulder seasons. Dug into a slope, ideally on the north side, lined with stone and covered with insulating earth, a proper root cellar holds a steady, cool temperature that can keep cabbage, potatoes, and apples fresh for months. This was standard practice on American farms well into the mid-20th century. Cutting ice from frozen ponds in winter and storing it in an insulated ice house packed in straw or sawdust was the primary method of refrigeration before electric coolers. Properly insulated, ice can last well into summer. None of this disappeared because it stopped working. It disappeared because electrification, appliance financing, and modern building codes made the alternatives inconvenient, or in some cases, technically non-compliant with newer codes, not because of any single coordinated conspiracy, but because of a genuine, well-documented shift in how American homes were built and financed through the mid-20th century. It's also worth being honest about the other side of that shift. Modern residential codes exist largely because older building practices, cold wells and root cellars included, came with real trade-offs. A poorly maintained cold well or spring house can become a contamination risk if it isn't sealed properly, which is part of why food safety and sanitation codes tightened over the century. That doesn't make the underlying physics wrong, but it's a reason to treat these as things to build carefully and maintain, rather than as techniques that were simply suppressed for no good reason. Anyone replicating them today should follow local code and basic food safety practice, not just old instructions. Paint a metal drum flat black, mount it in full sun, and run your incoming water line through it. On a clear day, water inside can reach well over $100 de grad before it even hits your water heater, cutting the energy needed to bring it the rest of the way. Bring food to a boil, cook briefly, then transfer the sealed pot into an insulated box packed with hay, straw, or blankets. Residual heat continues cooking the food for hours with a fraction of the fuel. This was documented by agricultural colleges in the early 20th century as one of the most fuel-efficient cooking methods available at the time. Traditional farm windmills, the classic multi-bladed style, not modern turbines, can pump meaningful volumes of water at relatively low wind speeds and require very little maintenance beyond periodic greasing. Some of these mechanisms have been in continuous use for the better part of a century. If you live in a suburban house with a mortgage and an HOA, most of this can still be adapted. It's already below grade, already surrounded by earth that stays relatively stable in temperature. Sectioning off a corner with insulation and a small vent that you open at night in cooler months can turn it into serviceable cold storage for produce and preserves through fall and winter. It can be dug in a shaded corner of a yard, lined with block, covered with an insulated lid, and vented, a scaled-down version of the farmhouse original. Work on any house, regardless of age. A solar chimney uses a dark painted surface behind glass on a sun-facing wall. The trapped air heats, rises, and pulls air out through a vent near the top, creating gentle negative pressure that draws cooler air in from the shaded side of the house. No fans, no moving parts, just convection. A flour and water paste applied to strips of paper pressed into window and door gaps was a traditional low-cost method of winter draft sealing, removable in spring. Modern weather stripping and caulk now do the same job more durably, but the underlying principle, sealing air leaks, remains one of the single most effective low-cost ways to cut heating and cooling loss in any home. Before moving further down the list, it's worth naming the single biggest factor behind most home energy loss because it isn't glamorous: insulation and air sealing. Building science research consistently finds that uncontrolled air leakage through gaps around windows, doors, and penetrations accounts for a large share of a typical home's heating and cooling loss, often more than any single appliance choice. That's part of why the old flour paste trick worked as well as it did. And it's also why, dollar for dollar, sealing and insulating a home usually delivers a bigger return than almost any of the more elaborate techniques on this list. It's the least exciting fix here, and probably the most important one. A stacked wood pile against a north wall, or any dense material against an exterior wall, adds a modest insulating and thermal buffering effect, though it's a much smaller factor than proper wall insulation. An outdoor pit lined with straw, layered with root vegetables and covered with more straw and soil, was a standard way to store a harvest through winter without any cellar at all. Wood ash soaked in water produces a lye solution that, combined with fat, makes basic soap, a genuinely old and still practiced method in some Amish households. Grinding whole wheat berries fresh rather than buying pre-milled flour preserves more of the grain's natural oils and nutrients, though it's more labor-intensive. Sauerkraut, pickles, and other lacto-fermented vegetables require only salt, water, and a container, no refrigeration or canning equipment, and remain a staple preservation method in many Amish kitchens. A greenhouse built onto a south-facing wall extends the growing season and can add meaningful passive heat to the adjoining room on sunny winter days. Beekeeping for wax as well as honey provides a renewable, non-petroleum light source and remains common in Amish households that keep hives. Heating wash water over a wood fire and line-drying clothes in the sun remains standard practice in many Amish communities, particularly in warmer months. A block of ice in an insulated space will noticeably cool a small room for hours as it melts. A genuinely old, low-tech form of air conditioning. Cast iron hand pumps at a kitchen sink, drawing from a cistern or well, provide water access independent of the electric grid, useful during outages as much as day-to-day. Simple sawdust-based composting systems, as documented in homesteading literature since the 1990s, eliminate water use and sewage costs, with compost usable on non-food plantings after a sufficient composting period. A steel drum converted into a simple wood stove can heat a workshop or outbuilding cheaply using scrap wood. Kits for this are commercially available today. A well-made scythe, handsaw, or other quality hand tool, properly maintained, can outlast multiple generations of powered equivalents. This is a real and still used technique, sometimes called a drain water heat recovery coil. Copper tubing wrapped around a vertical drain pipe, typically beneath a shower, captures a portion of the heat from outgoing hot water and transfers it to incoming cold water before it reaches the water heater. Because a shower drain runs hot water fast and steady, this passive heat exchange can meaningfully reduce the energy needed to reheat water. Modern versions of this exact device are sold commercially and are recognized by some energy efficiency programs today. It's inexpensive, requires no moving parts, and can often be installed without touching the drain itself, just wrapping the outside of the pipe. None of these techniques are secret or hidden. Most are documented in old agricultural extension publications, homesteading references, and building science literature that's publicly available. You don't need a rumor to find them, just a search. What they share is a common thread. They rely on basic physics, thermal mass, evaporation, convection, insulation, rather than mechanical or electrical systems, which is exactly why they still work today in a suburban basement as much as in a Pennsylvania farmhouse. They weren't erased. They were mostly just outcompeted by convenience, financing, and modern codes. A real, well-documented shift in 20th century American life, even without a hidden hand behind it. What's genuinely interesting isn't that this knowledge was hidden. It wasn't. But that it stopped being necessary for most people, and so it stopped being taught. That's a very different story than a conspiracy, but it leads to the same practical conclusion. The techniques still work, they're still documented, and reviving even a few of them in a modern home is mostly a matter of time and modest cost rather than any lost secret.